Hello and welcome to FrostBytes, where logistics and tech meet a fresh perspective. I'm your host and co-founder of PackSafe, Ilya Preston, and today I have the honor of speaking with our guest, Nina Heinz. Nina, a logistics expert with over 20 years of experience in the life science and healthcare sectors, is based in Paris, France. A little jealous there. Nina's global career has spanned air, land, and ocean transportation, with a special focus on cold chain logistics. She brings deep industry expertise in GDP, good distribution practices, regulatory compliance, helping businesses navigate the complex world of temperature sensitive products and transportation. Throughout her career, Nina has led global teams and driven large scale change management programs for top clients, including her role as global head of logistics and cold chain at AP Moller Maersk, and before that, DHL. She's also made significant impacts as a steering committee member for the PDA's European branch and as a full member of Pharma Aero, working on cross industry collaboration to improve air cargo logistics for the pharmaceutical sector. We are very excited to have her on and to have her share her story and insights with us today. So with that, Nina, great to have you, and thank you for being here.
Thanks, Ilya, and thank you for the warm welcome.
Of course, yeah. So before we get into it, before we get into your background, I think in true FrostBytes fashion, we always want to start off with a little shock to the system with what we call Nina's hot take. So I think the world wants to know, what is the one opinion on the industry, on cold chain logistics, on anything cold chain transportation related, that you have that you think others might find controversial or contrarian?
Thanks, Ilya. I think I've spent several years in the industry, and I always like to be a little provocative. So I
Mhm.
would say that from my perspective, I feel that today actually cold chain is no longer the topic. I think we've come a long way in cold chain. We've done a lot of developments in terms of packaging, in terms of data loggers, even in terms of the services being provided by air, ocean, and road transportation providers with certifications. So I feel like we've made a lot of progress, and we can be very proud of that progress that we've made. But I feel as though it's not really the topic of today anymore. It's kind of old news. I kind of feel like we need to move to the next topic. And for me, that next topic is very much connected to sort of the geopolitical landscape that we're dealing with today, whether it be the pandemic, whether it be the crisis that we're also facing in Gaza or Ukraine, and it's all connected to that resilience. So I really feel that the true challenge that we're facing right now is making sure that we have an agile and flexible supply chain, and I think that's even especially relevant for the life sciences industry. If I go back and reflect, it's been 5 years in France, at least today, when we went into lockdown for the pandemic. And since, there's been a lot of other disruptions to the supply chain and a lot of uncertainties. And I think supply chain managers are really struggling with that. And I think it's one of those areas that we really have to focus on, where we can truly say that agility is no longer a luxury, but it's truly a necessity. And that resilience should be really at the core of everything that we do for our life sciences supply chain.
That's incredibly well said. Where do you see the current gaps are? So in terms of looking at geopolitical events, large scale kind of disruptions that you're alluding to,
Mhm.
where do you think the lack of preparedness is across the board within healthcare and life sciences?
So I think a lot of it is based still to the fact that I still don't feel that as a supply chain, we are digitally savvy enough and are actually using the data that we have on hand to truly drive knowledge. So I
Mhm.
think using that information and using that database planning and scenarios and simulation is one of the areas where I really feel that we haven't really taken that and owned it and driven it to the full potential that we have to live. And the other element I think is then kind of comes with that is the whole element of risk-based management. So using that data to drive, a risk-based approach, and using that data also to collaborate with partners. Even the data that we have on our partners can help us drive closer relationships and drive, a better collaboration with them. So it's about making sure that we have that true visibility
Yeah.
and allowing us to use all of that to really drive resilience.
So let's take that maybe a layer deeper. I think the two things that you mentioned are spot on. It seems that the first one maybe is a direct input to the second. So you need to first digitize your data
Yep.
to be able to use it in a constructive way to understand your network performance and risk. What do you think is the barrier to drive faster, more aggressive, more accelerated digitization? Why aren't processes, SOPs, data visibility, why aren't these things becoming more and more digitized?
I would say in a simple word, it's people. So I think all of us are resistant to change. And there is a bit of that we become creatures of habit and have a certain comfort zone that we're in. And going into new areas, requires more than just a simple IT change. It's much bigger than that. And so I think overcoming that resistance to change is truly the element that we need to consider, because it's all about driving stakeholders and understanding where they're coming from, what's in it for them, driving the adoption of those stakeholders. And I think that at the moment, for me, it's not about the technology. The technology is there. It's finding the right use cases, and it's convincing the different people involved to actually use it to their full potential and to see the benefit that it can drive for them.
I couldn't agree more. I can't tell you how many real-time visibility implementations we've been a part of.
I can imagine. Yeah.
I think the common kind of misconception is that the intelligence, the AI, that piece is the hardest. It's literally getting the devices out in the network and having all the regions follow the SOPs and push the button on the device the right way, stop the device the right way. That is the biggest challenge, I think, and you're spot on. I think it's part resistance to change, part undervalue of change management in general.
Exactly.
So no, that's a great
fear of the unknown maybe as well, right? There's a little bit of that always in us. We're kind of going, I don't know if I'm comfortable with that.
Yeah. No, that's spot on. So let's switch gears a little bit and go to your journey in what we call Nina's Cold Start. So you've obviously had an incredible path. I think we mentioned DHL, Maersk earlier. Can you tell us a bit about your journey and how you ended up in cold chain and logistics?
Sure. So I think when I speak to a lot of people, you realize a lot of us don't actually plan to go into cold chain or into logistics. You kind of fall into it and you become addicted and you kind of stay there. And that's exactly what happened to me. Right. So, I studied international politics, so it has nothing to do with that, although I do a lot of politics on a daily basis, I would argue, but, in a different scope. So it's much more, I think, about the fact that my first experience was a real memorable one. I had an incredible mentor and boss in one of my first roles. I was back with the Lufthansa cargo days, and her name was Monica. And she was a true inspiration in terms of a leader that I really looked up to, in the sense that her leadership was all about making sure that we would bring together industry leaders with a common mindset, with a common ambition, open sharing, and quickly actually realizing that all of us in the supply chain were facing the same challenge. And that challenge back in the days was all about how do we ship 2 to 8 shipments, right? So it was truly about having, shippers coming with whether it be blood plasma, whether it be insulin, or whether it be vaccines as an example as well. But truly having different partners coming together and understanding that all of us play a role in the supply chain. And that all of us need to collaborate and bring that together. We had some very, very heated debates and heavy discussions because we didn't always agree on the table, but it was very important to kind of bring everybody together and have that partnership approach. So it was more of a bigger picture. It wasn't, each one of us plays a role, absolutely, but what can we do together? And all of that driven, I think, for me personally, and you'll probably hear that from a lot of people in the life sciences industry, about more of the altruistic vision as well. So it's much bigger than that. There's always a patient somewhere waiting for a product, and that patient could be the vaccine for your child. It could be the insulin for your mother. So the greater purpose and meaning, I think, is what really brought us all together. And allowed us to then really collaborate and overcome some of those barriers. So that first experience for me was really the one where I would say I got hooked. And I've really stayed in life sciences supply chain ever since, and I've never regretted it. And it's something that I'm truly passionate about.
Yeah, I think that's a common thread across the board, at least the altruistic thread of what brings people in to start, and
Mm-hmm.
then maybe gets them through the long days of what in
True.
logistics can be. So no, that's a great story. You mentioned two-way shipments. Did I hear that right? So trying to set up, was it two-way shipments that you were trying to solve the problem for?
It was more about 2 to 8, sorry.
Oh,
So
two
it
to
was a
eight.
2 to 8 temperature range, right? So if you look at that was sort of the temperature range that we were focusing on at the very beginning, especially for insulin and for vaccines, blood plasma, et cetera. So that was the big challenge. Again, it's a while back, right? So
Exactly.
as you mentioned, over 20 years ago, but that was kind of how I got started. And it's maybe not the hot topic, as I mentioned, anymore today, because I think we've come a long way.
Yes.
But that's, I think, still a focus for a lot of people.
Do you think temperature management in the supply chain is still an issue? Maybe perhaps beyond 2 to 8, maybe getting into cryo or into frozen. Do you think there are challenges there, or do you think across the board, all products within all temperature ranges, it's kind of been that there are good solutions in place to move
I
forward?
think there's definitely some very, very good solutions out there. There's been a lot of innovation, both sort of on the passive as well as the hybrid and the active side of, the packaging that's available. Same thing also from a data logger perspective. Even if you look the warehousing facilities, what the ground handlers and airlines are doing at airports, what the trucking providers are doing, even what's happening in the sea freight industry there from a reefer container perspective. So there's a lot of really good developments. To your point, though, I think indeed the very deep frozen range is still one I think where yes, indeed, we're still seeing some challenges and still seeing growth. So there's kind of that, that issue that we're seeing there where there's probably some more potential. And I suspect that there will probably be some more, hopefully, innovations coming down the line where we see some developments on that end.
Yeah. So I completely agree with you, by the way, that there's a ton of great solutions that are out there and in place for temperature management, temperature control. I'm curious, how do you bridge the gap between having all these solutions that are out there and,
Mm-hmm.
in large part, you're right, the temperature management issue is solved, but then yet having product loss ratios that continue to kind of go up year after year and still having so much waste in the industry? How do you bridge that gap?
I think the waste for me is still coming from managing the unexpected. So
Mhm.
you can plan everything, until the minor detail, but you will always need strong contingency plans. So I think that kind of comes with taking that risk-based approach and making sure you're agile, you're flexible, you have strong partnerships in place, and that you have that plan B. So from my perspective, it's not necessarily the fact that that you've selected the wrong packaging partner or the wrong carrier or the wrong freight forwarder, et cetera. It's very much more about making sure that you have that plan in place because things do go wrong and they go wrong all the time and things change even more often. So for me, the waste that we're still seeing in the supply chain, I think for me essentially comes from that, where we're so much focused on, we think we're dealing with a very static situation when actually no, the supply chain is all about all these variables and that changes all the time. And it makes it for me what's exciting, but it also means that indeed you need to be able to, be agile and flexible.
And work 24/7.
True.
Um, so that's a good transition point. You mentioned, some of those things going wrong. The next segment that we like to discuss it's called our hot challenges segment.
Okay.
So could
Okay.
you share maybe one of the biggest hurdles you've ever faced? What's been the toughest test of your career?
You hinted at it at the beginning, and it kind of triggered something in my mind as well, which is all about platform implementation. So I've been involved in my career in two major platform implementations for companies that I work with, very closely related to cold chain. And I have to say that those were probably the biggest hurdles and biggest challenges that I've ever faced in my life. A lot of sleepless nights and countless working weekends and what have you. So I think for me, it's all about the fact that there is this misperception at the very beginning that it's an IT project, and that's what we're trying to implement. And yet, depending on the IT or digital maturity of the company and the partners and the stakeholders that you're working with, that can actually be a very lengthy and drawn out process. And that actually it's a much more holistic and cross-functional element that you need to consider. And so that was sort of a big learning experience for me. And I thought the second time would be easier, but it wasn't. So indeed, it's still one of the areas I think where there's a lot of investments that need to be made in terms of making sure that we truly drive transformation and change. There's a lot of pressure, of course, that always comes in terms of expectations of a very quick return of investment. But I think there needs to be a very strong perception of one, that this is indeed a very complex process, that you need to bring in the feedback from the ground up. We did a lot of Gemba walks, we did a lot of workshops, and that was, I think, for me, essential to truly understand the user perspective, to also understand the customer feedback and views, and to bring that in from the very beginning and involve them to help also in terms of the adoption of the platform itself, which was truly critical. So if you don't involve everybody from the very beginning in gaining insight, you're building the wrong platform, and you're going to be building one that actually nobody wants. And that's operationally also not viable. And then I think connected to that was for me also the experience that it's extremely important to put in place measurable KPIs, and that those KPIs are not just connected to the IT project again, right? So that you're actually focusing on, well, has this driven user satisfaction? Has it reduced, to your point earlier, maybe, some of the irregularities and temperature deviations that we're seeing? Has it created greater customer engagement and satisfaction? Has the business grown through this? But it's not something that happens overnight. So the length that this falls into place, it requires a lot of patience. It requires senior management commitment. It requires trust in the organization, because it's a roller coaster ride, and that's how I've experienced it. But it's one, I think, where we still have a lot to learn. It could probably be easier, but it's one of the big ones, I think, that we're on this journey as an industry, even together, of driving that digital transformation. And again, it's much bigger than just a platform. It's all
Mhm.
about the people. It's about the processes and driving that.
And your specific, you mentioned the two implementations that you were a part of
Mhm.
being the toughest. Were these like ERP TMS implementations? Were these actual visibility?
More from a TMS perspective.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Those life cycles can get pretty long.
Oh, they are. They're
Mm.
they're monsters, right? So they're so huge, but it's we need them, right? They're incredibly important, but they
Sure.
really transform the way of doing business. So it's not sort of an end game. You start looking at the people, you start looking at the processes, and it's actually quite a massive transformation journey that you're on.
That's right. Yeah. And I think you're also, with your advice to kind of make sure you're building what the business needs and wants,
Mm,
the customer needs and wants
right.
is spot on. You're probably going to save a lot of startups years of blood, sweat, and tears in terms of making sure that the number one advice that I give to startups that are just starting out, or founders that are just starting out, is
Hmm.
go out there and just do nothing but talk to customers. It
Yeah,
should really be
exactly.
110% of your time. Yeah.
Yeah,
No,
exactly.
that's always great advice. I think it rings true even in the larger enterprise
Hmm.
atmosphere as well, right?
No, absolutely.
So makes sense. All right. Um, so I think this next segment is always my favorite segment.
Okay.
It's We call this our lightning round: hot,
Hmm.
cool, or cold.
Hmm.
So tell me if you are bullish, neutral, or pessimistic, hot, cool, or cold,
Yep.
on each of the following subjects in 30 seconds or less.
Oh boy. Okay. Shoot.
All right.
Go for it.
Real-time IoT visibility.
Very hot. So I think
Ooh,
that for me is definitely red hot. However, I would be a little challenging on that in terms of it's much more about just collecting the data. That's the very, very, very beginning of the very first step that you're taking. That's planting the seed. It's very much more about what are we actually then going to be doing with the data, and that's, I think, still where we need more advancements and innovation, to gather that data and to create knowledge and to then actually drive actionable insight. So that's where I think the true value is.
what do you think should and could be done with that data?
Oh, there's just so much potential. I think we're just at the, seeing the tip of the iceberg. And I think if you ask the younger generation, they probably have some really great and crazy ideas of everything that we can do from that perspective. But I think in terms of even just looking at automating the whole risk assessment process and driving that information, using it also to, in some form or shape, also automate the intervention that potentially that comes along with that data that you're collecting. I think there's just so much that we can do. I think we're just really seeing at the very tip of it.
Okay. How about data agnostic control towers? What I mean by that is, how much importance do you put, if you're thinking about a visibility control tower,
Yep.
how much importance do you put on the need for that to be data agnostic, meaning you can pull in different types of data, different devices, versus actually utilizing the control tower that maybe a device provider has on their own, in which case it's not separated from the device. So do you believe
Yep.
it should be separated or together, or does it matter?
I think it very much depends on the power that the control tower has to actually intervene. That for me is the critical. So whether or not the data is, let's say, coming from different sources, whether or not the control tower is neutral, you have a situation where maybe you have a neutral control tower, but that control tower has absolutely no empowerment in terms of needs to make 10 phone calls to get anything done and try to intervene and actually save a shipment that's potentially facing an irregularity, versus ones that are potentially more narrow in scope, only for one specific stakeholder in the supply chain, but that can immediately intervene and get it done when they need to. So I would say really it depends on the situation. There's a fine line, but I think for me, the control tower, it's about control. So where is the control and the power to intervene? And that I think should be the critical element to drive that decision.
Yeah, well said. How about passive data loggers? Here to stay, or are they going away?
I would hope they would go away. No, I know that's a little provocative as well, and I know that there's some very good reasons for them still to be used, but I would like to see them replaced in the long run, because I think that we just have some incredible technology out there that just allows for so much more. So that I would say I'm more on the cool side of things and
Oh,
saying, I hope they go away.
if you gave me a hot on this one and IoT, I'd probably start asking some questions. That could have also been your controversial take, because a
True.
lot of people feel very, very strongly about
I
passive.
know. I know.
How about automated product release? Is it ready for prime time in the sense that the automate, and obviously there, with pharma there's a GXP validation aspect to it, as you know.
Right.
Automation of accepting, rejecting, quarantining product and making those quality decisions
Mm-hmm.
through your control tower. Do
Mm-hmm.
you believe that that the industry is ready to embrace that automation, or do you think there's still this tension between quality and making sure they're doing everything and kind of signing off on everything manually?
I think there probably is still some resistance and some tension there, absolutely. I think, though, it could be seen as a tool to facilitate things where you can actually allow quality to focus on those very, top issues that they really need to spend time on. So I think it's about driving greater efficiency, in the sense of that there's so many great tools out there that you could use to kind of do that first screening and that first wave. And as you sort of mature and get more comfortable, then you can kind of take it a level, take it a notch up. So I think it's more of a progressive phased approach that you probably want to use. But to your point, yes, quality will always want to have the final word, but maybe they just need to have a little bit more bandwidth and time to actually focus on what's important versus getting lost in the noise.
Yep, makes sense. Risk management software.
Absolutely essential. I think that's a big one. I think there's still a lot of potential there in terms of how we could further develop it. There is a lot of providers that provide it. It's currently on the market, but yes, I mean that kind of goes with the whole process of automation. Does it replace maybe test shipments? Probably not, but I think it's a very good foundation.
Okay. How about build versus buy for industry giants, including maybe some that you used to work with on the LSP, on the logistics service provider side? Do you think
Build
that
and buying what?
uh,
Warehousing or
control towers, visibility, risk, all of these things that we talked about,
hmm.
automated product release, do you think they're more inclined to try to build everything themselves, or do you think they're more inclined to partner, or does it vary kind of provider by provider?
I think it depends on also the maturity of the company. I think some of the big providers out there have made some substantial investments already and are building in-house solutions, and it makes sense because they offer a global network to a very large customer base. So I think that there the investment is worth it. I think there's other players in the market that indeed are looking to partner and to learn and to innovate. I think for me, the success actually is probably going to be a mixture of both, because you'll always want to do some work in-house, but those crazy ideas will probably come from outside. And why reinvent the wheel when you can actually bring on board some partners who can support you on that journey?
Yeah, fair enough. How about last one, Gen AI,
Mhm.
specifically in temperature controlled logistics? Is it a fad, or do you think it's ready for prime time?
I think it's still a bit of a fad because, in all honesty, even from my own personal perspective, I'm struggling to understand how this could be applied. And so I think there's still a lot of that sense in the industry that it's kind of one of those buzzwords that people tend to use very broadly. But to truly understand the use cases behind it and how it can apply, especially given sort of how I would say immature still the supply chain is, I think it may be for the moment, maybe be overstepping it.
Okay. So maybe on that note, what role do you, if any, what role do you see like AI having in optimizing supply chain operations in its current state?
So I think there's a lot of opportunities there. I mean, simply looking at, if you look at it from a warehousing perspective, there's a lot of things that you can do there in terms of automation and in terms of robotics, in terms of picking and packing, but also in terms of the inventory management
Mhm.
to, reduce stockouts, reduce a lot of issues that we're currently having there, overstocking or stockouts as well. I think you can use it, as I mentioned earlier, also in terms of partnerships. So selecting those best suppliers, but truly on a data-based approach and using some of that information that's already available so it facilitates your decision making.
Yeah.
And then I think, going back to sort of the optimizing your routes and lane risk assessments, I think that's a big area where I would still see us trying to drive greater resilience, right? To kind of go back to what I mentioned initially. And then also compliance to the regulatory requirements. And I think there we could definitely use a lot of AI to really manage that data and derive knowledge from it.
That's great input, Nina. So before we wrap up, we'd love to hear about a logistics legend story. So maybe a time when you or a colleague, a former colleague, went above and beyond to get the job done. Could be throughout the pandemic, could be before that, could be after that. Do you have anything that sticks out that's memorable?
So what usually sticks out in my mind are disasters. And disasters, and this was for me a true disaster that happened way before the pandemic and in my early days, because it was truly for me a learning experience. And it was very much about, I received a call during the holiday season. It was end of the year, close to Christmas, and it was all about saying, we have a customer here, a life sciences customer, and we have just frozen a huge shipment. And it was one of those things, one of those calls that you really don't want to hear. And with all best intentions, the ground staff had actually moved 2 to 8 degree shipment and left it outside because I said it was a cold shipment, so we'll leave it outside, except it was a snowy and cold winter night, and the shipment completely froze. So that for me was a huge learning experience in the sense of that we then actually ran the investigation with the support of the customer and realized that it's all about the people, in the sense of they had the best intention. They thought it was a cold shipment. They had misunderstood and misinterpreted the label on the shipment as well as the instructions. They hadn't been sufficiently trained, and that's why something like this happened. Interestingly enough, we had a very strong relationship with the customer, and the customer said, I'm going to show you why this is so important, and took us on a manufacturing site tour. And that was a true, mind opener for me as well, because it gave me an understanding why this is so important and why indeed it's all about people. And people are our biggest asset, and that still stays with me today. And everything that I do is that it's always about the people. They're the core of everything that we do, and it's extremely important to make sure we bring them on board.
Yeah, and sometimes seeing how and why the sausage is made the way that it is
Yep,
helps contextualize why your role as a part of that process is so important.
yep, exactly.
So, Nina, thank you so much for sharing your journey and insights. To wrap up, could you maybe leave our listeners with one final cool piece of advice? It could be career related, it could be pharma or life sciences related, supply chain focused, anything that you think would resonate with our audience. And you already gave kind of one or a couple of good pieces of advice in terms of always understanding the customer, making sure you're
Mhm.
tying back to value, but more generic, what's the biggest piece of advice that you could share?
There's never a boring day in life sciences, and I think that's what's kept me so passionate about the job. And I think what's extremely important is to always stay open-minded and to committed to always learn. People say you only have one mouth, but you have two ears. So it's about listening. It's about learning. To your point, listening to obviously to the customer, listening to our teams, listening to our partners, and driving that collaboration, I think, is extremely important. So there's never a day when I don't learn, and if I would, then I would probably be doing the wrong job. But indeed, I think it's making sure that that we still remain curious, that we listen, and that we learn, so that we can continuously drive what we're doing for the life sciences industry.
So that's great advice. One follow-on question to that.
Yeah.
Obviously, you come from the service provider side, so
Yep.
pharma and life sciences and produce, BCOs or manufacturers were your customers. How do you square the difference between always be listening, taking advice, and the Henry Ford quote of if I would have listened to what the customers had told me, they would have said a faster horse, or they would have asked a faster horse.
True.
So how do you square that difference, and how do you kind of weigh both of those viewpoints and determine how much you lean on either side?
That's a tricky one. And I think it also comes with not only listening to your customer, but also listening to your own colleagues and your own team. So it's the folks on the ground. I've been through many different airports. I've done so many audits at different locations and around the world. And I think it's actually being on the ground and seeing in the field how things are done, which gives you the true understanding. And I think it's driving that combination, indeed, with what the customer wants, but then also what's possible on the ground, and potentially where some of the challenges are, but also where some of the opportunities are. So I think for me, it's driving that combination between the two.
Perfect. That's one cool wrap for FrostBytes. Nina, thank you so much for being here and for all the wisdom that you've shared. Really appreciate it. To our listeners, thanks for continuing to tune in. Our first 4 episodes crossed 47,000 views and counting. So certainly, I don't think any of us were expecting that, but please do keep it going. Don't forget to subscribe and stay connected for more insights from leaders in cold chain logistics. Ilya Preston, your host. Until next time, thank you so much.